Canada is one of the world's most fascinating countries. We have many feats that we are proud of and countless others that we disapprove of. Regardless, one thing we fail to address as a nation is our long and distinct history. For example, did you know that all Canadians say A after a sentence? I bet you didn't, eh? Jokes aside, my name is Zoya, and this is the Canadian Perspective, the show where we discuss Canada's history with famous Canadian figures to get an authentic insight on notable events that have impacted our nation. One topic we do not disregard as much, however, still do not get the recognition it deserves, is Canada's military role. To sum up, this theme covers how Canada has maintained security, protected its citizens, and promoted its strategic interests at home and abroad. Something that many Canadians overlook is the size of the Canadian Armed Forces, which totals to 40,000 personnel. This demonstrates the sheer military influence Canada has as a nation and what potential capabilities that our country has to make a local, national, or even international impact. Today's show will be addressing Canada's military role in four famous crises. In Afghanistan in the 2000s, the 1991 Gulf War, the Libyan airstrikes, and the Syrian Civil War. To understand how our armed forces participated in these events, we have four guests today. Lieutenant General Charles the Butcher Bouchard, Abdul Hakim El Youssef, and a veteran from the 1991 Gulf War, Captain Duncan Dusty Miller. Without further ado, take it away for our first guest, Lieutenant General Charles the Butcher Bouchard. Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard is a retired Royal Canadian Air Force general. On 25th March of 2011, Bouchard was named Commander of Operation Unified Protector, NATO's military intervention in Libya. Bouchard had a large role in the military intervention in Libya and was Canada's representative of NATO during that war. He will be speaking to us today about the Libyan airstrikes. I'd like to welcome him right now.
Hi, Russ.
Hi, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Alright, let's get straight to business. So, I just wanted to inquire, why were the Libyan airstrikes significant for Canada, and what impact did it have on its military role?
So, as a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force, this was one of Canada's biggest involvements in a military conflict I've witnessed myself through my 3-decade career. Even when compared with countless others previous conflicts such as the 1991 Persian Gulf War and Kosovo, the Libyan Civil War has a far larger standing. Now, Canada has a bigger role and established a far larger commander presence. This can be seen through my position as commander of the Operation Unified Protector mission, which led NATO's intervention in the Libyan Civil War that you are talking about.
Wow, that was really insightful. Thank you. So, what caused Canada to join the Libyan Civil War, and what were the consequences of Canada joining this war?
Canada chose to join the Civil War due to many human rights issues that were occurring in Libya. There was alleged violations including rape, extrajudicial killings, ethnic cleansing, misconduct, and bombings of civilians. There's an estimation between 500 and 700 people that were killed by Gaddafi's security forces in February 2011 before the rebels even revolted. Furthermore, nearly 300 women were also reported to have been raped, and Gaddafi's forces allegedly shelled towns with heavy weapons, risked civilian lives indiscriminately, fired rockets, mortars, and artillery shells. This shows how much of a fiend Gaddafi was. And this goes to show why we as a nation had an obligation to join the Civil War. So after the Libyan government started to target protesters violently, NATO answered the United Nations call to protect the Libyan people. In March 2011, a coalition of NATO allies and partners began enforcing an arms embargo, maintaining a no-fly zone, and protecting civilians and civilian populated areas from attack or due to the threat of attack in Libya. So with NATO's involvement in the Civil War, Canada was obligated as well as a member of NATO to join. So that would be, I guess, my response to why exactly Canada joined the war.
I see. Wow, some of that was really awful to hear about. But that brings me to my next question. How was Canada's participation in the Civil War perceived by world leaders, the rebels, and Gaddafi loyalists?
So, although you may think that Canada would be perceived in a light way due to joining the Civil War, actually, the NATO intervention in Libya was extremely controversial due to its failure in actually outlining what the true objectives were. Yes, it outlined that it is going for humanitarian purposes, but it was clear that they wanted a regime change, and that was the first priority of NATO. Though it does not follow from this that NATO failed to protect the Libyan population in its entirety. Even as a speaking member of NATO, now former, I think that this was extremely wrong for them to do. So also, further that point, Gaddafi and his loyalists responded by accusing opponents as those who have been influenced by hallucinogenic drugs, put in pills and drinks, when they heard that Canada and NATO nations were accusing them of such acts in terms of for human rights, and he blamed it on various different things. Even he claimed that Bin Laden and Al Qaeda were distributing these hallucinogenic drugs. He also blamed alcohol, which has been banned in Libya shortly after he took power. So at home, the public opinion to join the fight over here in Libya opposed by a margin of 2-1, and in Britain, 43% say that they are against the action, compared with 35% in support, which is an unprecedented level of discontent for the first days of British military campaign in Libya. But I guess that would kind of show the opinion and perspectives of people at the time of the Libyan war and what they believed about it. So Gaddafi loyalists obviously opposed it. NATO and Canada, many people didn't see what they were doing as ethical, but wanted to get a regime change. And the world in general did not enjoy what it was, even though NATO and Canada had its reasons for joining the Civil War, even though they may not be all that right when they said humanitarian causes. Who knows what it could have been, but that would be my response.
Well, those are all really great answers and a lot of very good insights. Thank you so much for coming to our show.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. See you guys.
Let's introduce our next guest, Abdul Hakim Al Yusuf. It's really great to meet you.
Hi,
Thanks so much for coming down.
No problem. Yeah, it was a long flight here, but I made it. Yeah.
I'm sure. So I'd first like to start out by asking you and get your perspective. What was the importance of the Syrian civil war?
Well, in March 2011, President Bashar al-Assad's authoritarian government, which was created by his father in 1971, faced some challenges. Well, a series of pro-democracy protests erupted around the country, and people demanded an end to Assad's regime. The government used violence to suppress demonstrations, making extensive use of police, military, and paramilitary forces. By 2012, the country was experiencing a full-fledged civil war. The first 5 years of the war, which began in 2011, an estimated 400,000 Syrians were killed, according to the UN envoy for Syria. As of March 2019, roughly 5.7 million Syrians have fled the country, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and more than 6.1 million people are displaced internally. The Syrian army and various militant groups are fighting to control territory in the country's northeast and northwest. The civil war has become a sectarian conflict, with religious groups opposing each other that affect the whole region and is heavily influenced by international interventions.
Wow, that's truly devastating to hear. So that brings me to my next question. What were the short-term and long-term effects of the Syrian civil war?
Well, as I previously mentioned, many of people died, and many of them were forced to move out of the country. But on top of that, the specific targeting of health facilities has significantly disrupted the health system, with communicable diseases such as polio re-emerging, and an estimate that more Syrians are dying from a lack of access to healthcare than as a direct result of the fighting. The education system has similarly been disrupted by damage to facilities and the use of schools as military installations. About 13.1 million people in the country need humanitarian assistance. Historic landmarks and once busy marketplaces have been reduced to rubble. War broke the social and business ties that bound neighbors to their community. And yeah, those are the short-term and long-term effects of this.
Wow, that's some really good insight. That leads me to my last question. How did political freedom and government change in Syria during the civil war change, and how did it stay the same?
Well, the government started out as being a very authoritarian government, and it has stayed the same. This is because, so this year is ending on a note of triumph for the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So Donald Trump has announced a rapid troop withdrawal from Syria, which is shocking everyone, including his own generals and diplomats. Last week, the UAE reopened its embassy in Damascus, which it had closed as a part of a campaign of multinational pressure against the regime in 2011. Bahrain followed suit, and other countries, including Kuwait, are expected to re-establish ties in the coming year. The Arab League is reportedly poised to readmit Syria, 7 years after expelling it.
Wow, great. Thank you so much for your perspective. I'm so sorry for what you've been through, and it's truly been a pleasure to have you here today. I hope you have a safe flight back.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Now that we're back from commercials, I'd like to introduce our third guest for today. We have Captain Duncan Musty Miller. He was the captain of the Canadian Naval Force, and he was placed in command in protecting and scheduling of the coalition. He's coming right in here. It's great to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on our show. You can take a seat. So I'd just like to begin by asking you, why? Let's just dive right into it. Why was the 1991 Gulf War such a significant war?
The 1991 Gulf War was started by Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. It was set for Iraq to invade Kuwait. The 1991 Gulf War was the first time that Egypt and other Arab nations have come together to form an anti-Iraq coalition and contribution force to military buildup. Fun fact, it was also known as Operation Desert Shield. America and Canada has also participated in the anti-Iraq. It was the first time ever in Canadian history that Canada sent women at war to be put under combat roles. It was also the first time in decades that Canadian Air and Naval Force supported each other in the war zone. Fun fact, the last time that happened, it was in 1968.
Wow, I'm sure most of us didn't know that. Thank you for educating us about that. So that brings me to my next question. What were the short and long-term causes of the 1991 Gulf War?
Iraq leader Saddam Hussein was the greedy leader, and ever since he became power in 1979, he had ruled Iraq with a reckless fist. He had a dictatorship of government style with a high amount of oil reserve in Kuwait, and the debt that Iraq had owned Kuwait. Hussein claimed that Kuwait was supposed to be ruled by Iraq, as he claimed that it was stated as its own country because the League of Nations, even though Kuwait became independent before Iraq sovereignty, UN gave the Iraqi army until January 15, 1991 to withdraw from Kuwait. But of course, Iraq refused. It refused, and UN deployed its offensive against Iraqi army in January 16, 1991. In the end, Iraqi army lost about 30,000 soldiers, but the Allied force only lost about 292 combined.
Wow, that's crazy. Thank you so much for your insight. And now my final question of our interview today. Did Saddam Hussein change his way of power in any way after the war?
In all honesty, no. He was a terrible leader since the start. Hussein did not change a single bit after the war. He was still a dictator. Actually, in fact, it felt like he was more mad about that they lost the war and decided to take it out on his own citizens. After the war, Hussein was not kicked out of power as Iraqi began to protest against Hussein. UN had accused that Hussein had used chemical weapons against its own citizens. As a result, the UN deployed their own inspector when they were deployed post-war. In 1997, Hussein decided to obey the command of UN and decided to jail up the UN inspectors that they were deployed in Iraq.
I see. Well, thank you so much for coming today and educating us about the Gulf War. It was really great to have you, and I hope you have a safe trip or flight wherever you're going back. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Take
for having
care.
me.
Yeah, take care. After a final commercial break, I'd like to welcome our final guest, Abdul Al-Batri Khan, and he'll be joining us live from a call from London. Hi, Abdul. So I wanted to start out by asking you our first question for today. How did the Afghan war happen, and what consequences did it have on Canada?
Having me. So the war in Afghanistan happened after the 9/11 attacks, and U.S. took this very personally, and with the help of allies, they tried to remove Taliban from power and dismantle the Al-Qaeda. So Canada also, this was Canada's longest battle from 2001 to 2014, and 40,000 Canadian forces served in this battle through a 12-year campaign. 165 Canadians also died, and 158 other allied countries also, soldiers died from that.
Great, thank you so much for your insight. Now I'd like to lead up to my second question for you. What was the significance of the Afghan war to Canada?
So this war was very significant to Canada because after the 9/11 attacks, Canada took this very personally and decided to help the US. It was also for a way for Canada to show its strength to the world and what it is capable of.
Thank you for shedding light on this very difficult topic. And for our final question of today, how has the war in Afghanistan changed over the past few years?
So throughout the years, this war in Afghanistan has changed a lot. For example, at the beginning of 2001, where the U.S. and its allies and Canada decided to attack the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, it was very dangerous to be in that area. However, throughout the years, as the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda got weaker and weaker, it is more safe. However, the emergence of ISIS has still made it dangerous, although it is much more safer than before.
Thank you so much for Lieutenant General Charles, Abdul Hakim Al-Yusuf, Captain Duncan Dusty Miller, and Abdul Al-Batri Ting for joining us today for this interview. And I'd like to finish off by saying, and this is the Canadian Perspective, the show where we discuss Canada's history with famous Canadian figures to get an authentic insight on notable events that have impacted our nation. And that's all for today's special. I'd like to wish all of you a great day. Thank you so much for joining us. Danong.